Good morning, this is Mr. Albers, and I am here to briefly take us through the Jesus in the Temple section of your guided notes. So if you are not there, either scroll or click over or pull those out, and we will jump in. Hopefully you got a chance to do the reading for the triumphal entry, or was it so triumphal, and answer those three questions. But that will move us nicely into this next section. So let's dive in. All right, so I'll start by reading Mark chapter 11, verses 12 through 21. You can follow along there in your notes. So the next day, so this is the day after Jesus has come into Jerusalem, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. So seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to find if it had any fruit. When he reached it, he found nothing but leaves, because it was not the season for figs. So the fig tree from a distance was in leaf, so it looked like it would have fruit. Jesus is hungry, he's human, he's feeling a very human thing. He gets to the tree, no fruit, no figs. Then he said to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard him say it. We're probably wondering, what has gotten into Jesus? Anyhow, so on reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple area and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. He would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, 'My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him, for they feared him, because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. When evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, so now we're on the next day here, as they went along, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. Peter remembered, and he said to Jesus, "Rabbi," or teacher, "look, the fig tree you cursed has withered." Okay, so you'll notice as it's structured here, there's kind of a sandwich of sorts, where Mark has arranged his material on purpose. He's arranged it topically. And so we get, at the beginning of this passage, we get this section of the fig tree. Okay, so think of that as one bookend, so to speak. Then we get Jesus driving out the money changers from the temple and teaching in the temple. And then Jesus goes out, and the next day we get the conclusion of the fig tree story. Okay, so think of the before and the after, the beginning and the end of the fig tree as kind of the boundary markers of this little piece of Mark, or the technical term, you don't need to remember this, but the technical term for a little piece like this, a passage that goes together, is a pericope. A pericope, a passage, a little section. Okay, very interesting. Jesus sees a fig tree, curses it. Next day, they walk by and they find that it's withered. What's going on? All right. Well, I think the key to this lies in looking at the meat of the sandwich, so to speak, the middle, right, which is this this incident, these things in the temple, and specifically at the Old Testament references that Jesus makes. One to Isaiah, one to Jeremiah, and then there's all sorts of other themes that are woven in here that we're going to look at. So let's start by looking at the fig tree. Okay, I'm not going to read out all of Isaiah 5, 1 through 7 here, but a couple things to notice. Look at how often the word vineyard appears. We got it here a couple of times in verse 1, we've got it here in verse 4, right, and then we've got it down here in verse 7. And there we're told that in this parable, there's a farmer, an owner's got a vineyard, he plants his vineyard, he sets it up for success, he looks for it to yield grapes, good grapes, but when he looked for it to yield grapes, it yielded wild grapes, right? And we see that again here in verse 2. What does that mean? Well, we get the interpretation in verse 7, right? The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel. The men of Judah are his pleasant planting. He looked for justice, but instead bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, an outcry. So this idea of injustice. Okay, so the vineyard is a symbol of Israel, and a symbol specifically of Israel not bearing good fruit. Keep that in mind as we turn our attention to what Jesus does with this fig tree in questions 1 and 2. So, looking at question 1, what is a fig tree or grapevine often a symbol of in Isaiah 5, 1 through 7? Well, very simply, God's people, in this case, the Israelites. Pretty straightforward. Let's look at question 2. So, how do we understand Isaiah's story about the owner, the vineyard, and what took place? What does everything represent? All right, so we might say that the owner, or maybe we could call him the farmer, is clearly God, right? He's the one that plants the vineyard. He's the one that comes and looks for a crop. The vineyard, remember, we're told explicitly, and we've just answered that, is God's people, the Israelites. And the crop that God looks for is their deeds or their actions, right? So we might say that he's looking for grapes. So he's looking for justice or righteousness. Maybe that reminds us of Amos 5, where God tells his people to let justice roll down like waters. But instead, he finds these wild grapes. Okay, so that would be unrighteousness. So God comes, and Israel, though she has been set up for success, though she's been given the law, though God has sent her prophets, she is continually rebelling against this to the point where, just like in the parable, the vineyard gets dug up. In Israel's history, she is sent off out of the promised land to Babylon into exile. And a similar thing is going to happen here in the near future. So again, keep that in mind as we think through what Jesus is doing with the fig tree, and as we turn to another passage of the Old Testament. All right, so now we turn our attention to the prophet Micah, an underrated prophet in my humble opinion. But Micah talks about a similar idea in chapter 7. So I'll just read that briefly. Woe is me. The word woe here is the opposite of blessing, right? So think of the Beatitudes, blessed are. The opposite of that would be woe is or woe unto. Because I become as when the summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned. There is no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires. Okay, so there's no fig, no grape. What does that mean? It means the godly has perished from the earth, and there was no one upright among mankind. Okay, so again, we have this connection between a good crop of figs or grapes and righteousness and godly living. So when the prophet Micah says he's looking for a crop of figs, he's looking for heartfelt obedience to God's law, right? Not just outward compliance, but actually living the way that God called and wanted his people to live. So let's put all this together. We've got a fig tree or a vineyard is a parable or a metaphor or a symbol for Israel. The crop that was produced should be good fruit, should be set up for success. So Jesus is walking. He sees from a distance a fig tree that looks like it's in leaf, looks like it's set up for success, and he comes and it's got no fruit. And he speaks a harsh judgment against it, and what does it do? It withers and it dies. And a quick word, depending on which gospel we're reading this story, some accounts say it just withered immediately. Others, like this one, talks about how Jesus came back the next day and found it. Are they contradicting? No. The disciples probably didn't notice that it withered right away, but when they came back the next day and found, oh my goodness, look at what's happened to it, they knew, as soon as Jesus spoke the word, the withering process had started. So that's that. Okay. With that in mind, let's turn our attention to another passage in Isaiah and talk about the temple. So keep in mind that in between the cursing of the fig tree and seeing that the fig tree is withered, where does Jesus go? Well, Mark tells us he goes to the temple, and he quotes from Isaiah 56. So again, I won't read this entire passage, although notice that this passage is about the Lord bringing foreigners into his house, bringing Gentiles, we might say, who hold fast to his covenant. He's going to bring them into his house. They're going to be joyful in his house of prayer. And look at what it says. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So now Jesus is going to come into the temple, and he's going to find the situation is very different from what Isaiah foretells. And we'll talk about that and look at questions 1 and 2 in the second part of the notes. So, what did Isaiah prophesy about Gentile foreigners in the temple? There's kind of redundancy there, Gentile foreigners. Well, they would come, right? Gentiles would come to the temple, that they would have access to God, that they would minister, right? They would not just be kind of onlookers from outside, but they would actually do service for the Lord. They would offer offerings, and of course we understand that through the lens of the sacrifice that Christ made once and for all. And they would pray, right? The temple would be a house of prayer for all nations. We might sum this up as saying the Gentiles would enjoy full inclusion, right? To the point that today, as Gentiles, we are not second-class citizens in the kingdom of God, right? So Jesus comes to the temple, and what does he find? He finds that in the outer area, which would be the one part of the temple that Gentiles at that time were actually allowed to come in, that's as close as they could get to the Lord. Do you think the Jews were doing a great job of reaching out and allowing them to worship? No, right? Quite the opposite, right? The Israelites are doing very poorly. And this is not necessarily new, right? Think about the most notorious Jewish prophet to a Gentile nation, Jonah, who's known not for like his great zeal and success, but for how strongly he tried to get out of going to save the Ninevites. In fact, we might say that Jonah did just the opposite. And so as Jesus comes into the temple, he sees that that same type of attitude is alive and well, because not only are Jews not making an effort to bring in Gentiles, but they're changing money, right? They're selling offerings. They're in the place where the Gentiles were supposed to be. And how on earth is a Gentile supposed to worship and pray when all that commerce is going on? And by the way, it's quite likely that the pricing that they were charging for these offerings, think of trying to buy food in a stadium, right? The prices go up a lot because that's the only market in town. Probably some of that too. And so Jesus is not thrilled, shall we say, with how Israel is doing. And it makes sense that he quotes from Isaiah and says, this is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, not a place where you're just making it a robber's den. You're just trying to make money off my Father's house. That phrase, den of robbers, also points us back to a passage in Jeremiah 7, where Jeremiah actually gives a sermon outside the temple shortly before the Babylonians came into Jerusalem and knocked it down. And so Jeremiah is speaking in a time when the northern kingdom of Israel has already been carted off into captivity by the Assyrians about 100 years prior. And so the southern kingdom, Judah, is still standing, and they still have the temple. And they've had this, it's almost become a superstition at this point, where they believe that because God's temple is in their midst, Jerusalem will never fall, right? How could God allow the place where his temple is to ever be destroyed? And so they believed that the mere presence of the temple protected them. And so they thought nothing of acting unjustly, oppressing the sojourner, the fatherless, the widows, the innocent, worshiping other gods, violating every single one of the 10 words or the 10 commandments, ignoring prophets like Jeremiah when they called them to repent, when God sent messengers to say, you need to turn from this. They didn't learn from history, right? The idea that God would not judge of people just because his temple's there is ridiculous if you think of your Old Testament history. I mean, remember the story of the Ark of the Covenant when the Israelites took it into battle thinking that would make God have to help them, and the Ark gets captured by the Philistines, and the Ark gets sent around, and God single-handedly makes a mockery of the Philistine gods. But it's not a good luck charm, right? Just because the Israelites have the temple, or just because they have the outward appearance of God's law, doesn't mean that God is just magically forced to protect them. And so Jeremiah tells them, you guys are no better than the Israelites already in exile. The temple of the Lord is not some good luck charm that's just going to be there to protect you. You have turned it into a den of robbers. And so, if we look at question 4, Jesus has a very similar message as Jeremiah does, right? It's the same song, second verse. Recalls what Jesus said to the Pharisees, you honor God with your lips, but your hearts are far from him, right? You've got the temple, you're going through the motions of making sacrifices, you've got a priesthood, but you're not actually doing the things that God wants. And so it's no wonder that Jesus is so angry and is disruptive to what's going on, right? The Israelites there have missed the whole point. Though they are set up for success with the temple, with the priests, with the law, they have kind of ignored all of that, and they are proving to be unfruitful. They are yielding wild grapes. All right, so putting the whole thing back together. The whole sandwich, so to speak. Remember the bookends, fig tree, Jesus is hungry, he looks for figs, there are none, he curses the tree. He goes into the temple, presumably hoping to find good fruit. There is none. There's just the opposite. And so he, in a sense, pronounces a curse on the temple, says it's become a den of robbers. Interestingly, if we were to go on and read the next chapters of Mark, we would find Jesus, the disciples say, Jesus, look at these great stones the temple's built up. Look at how impressive that is. And Jesus will say, I tell you the truth, not a single one of these stones will be left on top of another. And lo and behold, about 40 years later, the Roman army marched in and completely leveled that temple to the ground, and it has not been rebuilt since. So, why was the fig tree judged? The fig tree was judged as a symbol, or we might even say a real-time parable. Jesus is demonstrating with the fig tree what's about to happen to Israel, right? Both the fig tree and the Israelites should have produced fruit. Okay, Jesus came to both looking for fruit. They should have produced fruit. Neither actually did. And so just like the Israelites in the Old Testament, just like the vineyard in Isaiah's parable in Isaiah 5, just like Micah looking for figs in Micah 7, just like the Israelites in Jeremiah's day, thinking that they'd be fine because they had the temple, judgment is coming. God's curse is going to fall upon those who do not produce fruit, who have rejected his way of salvation. Well, right after this story in Mark, Jesus tells another parable, and he tells a parable about a master who's got a vineyard, and he rents it out to some tenants while he goes on a journey. And the tenants, as they're keeping the vineyard, the master begins to send servants to collect his share of the crop, and the tenants either beat or mistreat or kill each servant he sends without giving the master his share of the crop. Finally, the master sends his son, his only son, to the tenants, saying, surely they will respect my son. And the tenants see the son, recognize him, kill him, and at the end of the parable, the owner comes and he brings terrible judgment upon the tenants. He kills them, and he gives the vineyard to others. And this really made the Jewish religious leaders mad because they realized that Jesus was talking about them. What's the connection? Judgment is coming on God's people. And yet, even in the midst of this, it's not complete, because there are some of the Israelites who did believe, and God in his mysterious providence uses this for good. Because notice the very last part of this. He will come and kill those tenants, there's the judgment, and he will give the vineyard to others. And so again, in the mysterious, wise providence of God, the judgment that comes opens a door for Gentiles to come in. And to skip ahead to the book of Romans, we also await a day when that door that's open will also be entered by many, many ethnic Israelites as well. And God will have his one flock of people from every tribe, tongue, nation, language, which is not limited to the Israelites, but certainly does not exclude the Israelites either. So that's the parable of the fig tree. That's why Jesus curses it. It's not because he just had a temper, but it's a real life parable acting out very real realities of what happens when God's people turn their back on him and reject him. Okay, so that's that. Let me introduce your homework for the day, and then that'll be it.